Thank you for this really thought-provoking workshop. So I'm also a language person, so I want to talk about compositionality and compositionality in humans and in neural networks, large language models. I think we all have somewhat of an intuition about the kinds of behaviors that we consider to be compositional. So like, I think a lot of work on compositional generalization uses this example of like, if you've seen a blue square and an orange circle, you should be able to generalize to a blue circle. And you do this by kind of breaking the holes down into these kind of discrete features like color and shape and recombining them freely. In language, we also think of this as a very typically compositional domain because we have these kind of categories like nouns and verbs and prepositions, and we can recombine them very productively to form arbitrary new sentences. Obviously, formal languages are, the kind of go-to example of compositionality because we can define these kind of functions and arguments, and then we can, recursively combine them together to. So we have kind of an intuition about what kinds of behaviors we consider to be compositional. We don't have very much consensus around the actual definition of what it means to be compositional and what is the representations and the mechanisms underneath compositionality. So there are some very kind of lenient definitions that get used. I think of definitions like Barbara Partee says like the meaning of the whole is a function of the meaning of the parts and the way that they're combined. And this definition is like nice, but also not that theoretically useful, I would say, because it's met quite trivially. I think most systems, like any neural network, you could just say the output is a function of the inputs, and so you don't like get a lot of leverage in terms of what it really is, like what makes a compositional system different from a non-compositional. There's been a lot of debate in cognitive neuroscience, and especially computational cognitive neuroscience, on what is compositionality because of these more stringent definitions that get used, like Fodor and Polishin famously, that say that compositionality is really about like an intrinsic relationship between certain types of wholes. So like the sentence, the cat on, or the phrase, the cat on the mat, or the mat on the cat, are intrinsically connected by virtue of like being made out of the same parts, right? And so this is the kind of place that has led to a lot of debate about the quality of neural networks or the ability of neural networks to really explain cognition, especially powerful, flexible human cognition, which is compositional, because we have this kind of sense of what compositional behavior looks like, but there's a little lack of understanding and quite a bit of disagreement about what kinds of mechanisms, and particularly neural mechanisms, might plausibly support it in humans. And we have these kinds of symbolic systems that instantiate these more stringent definitions, but we don't have good neural stories of how they might appear. So we enter something like large language models, and these provide like a really nice opportunity to go into this debate because ostensibly they produce very human-like compositional behavior. So there's tons of examples in reasoning and inference, analogical reasoning, logical concept learning. Probably the best proof of concept is just they produce language and code, which are the kinds of things that we have always just said are compositional. And so we have this opportunity to basically say, well, what does compositionality look like in large language models? Because these are big neural networks that are doing the compositional things. They're not symbolic systems in this traditional account, so perhaps they can provide an alternative account of kind of what is going on here that gives us the things we want to have compositionality, but also is flexible and neural and non-compositional in the ways that humans also are. So that's what I want to look at today. I have a set of different studies that kind of point to different themes that I think have been coming out in this kind of converging picture of what compositionality looks like in current AI and what it might look like in humans. And I would say there are kind of three lines of evidence or findings, say. One is that the compositionality in large language models appears to be functional, by which I mean when they're solving complex tasks, they're breaking it up into a sequence of subtasks. Let's say that. The other, I think that is maybe among the most surprising results to me, is that it also appears to be what I'll call structural, which means that the network itself, like the weights itself, seems to reflect this kind of compositional structure of the function. And these two, I would say, are kind of consistent with this symbol system notion of compositionality. These are the kinds of terms we might use describing what Fodor and Polishin are describing. But there's this kind of third finding that I think is very important for making this kind of a new view of how we think about compositionality, or maybe a more human-like notion of compositionality, which is that, for lack of a better word, I'll call it's conventional, as in unlike a symbol system, it doesn't have to be compositional, and it's not compositional by design, but instead, depending on the context, depending on the input, it can behave quite compositionally, but also quite. So I'll start by talking about functional compositionality. This is work by my student Jack Marolo, and then work in progress by my other student, Porf. So we can look at these ideas. Let's look at a task like, what is the capital of Poland? We want the model to answer Warsaw. And we can look at this idea of kind of how is the model solving these complex tasks by kind of looking at the processing over layers. So these large language models have many layers. This is a smallish model with 24 layers. And you can basically look at how the model is trying to answer the question throughout processing across the layers. And in the early stages, you'll see that it's nowhere near the right answer. It has like no probability mass on the word Warsaw, and it's kind of guessing random frequent stuff from the training from language, parentheses, letters, yes and no. And then in about the mid-upper layers, there's more mass on Warsaw. It's kind of on topic, but actually its first choice for what to say here is Poland. And then there's an abrupt shift in the final layers where it switches to saying Warsaw. And so this is the kind of transition that I think is interesting, where we basically, if we think of this as a function, like a function of Poland, which produces Warsaw, you can see that there's a phase in the middle late layers where the argument is actually the kind of top prediction in word space, and then abruptly after switches to being a function. And so this transition, this kind of characteristic, like the argument peaks and then the output peaks, is pretty consistent and reproducible across a range of model sizes that we tested. And I'd say model families, slightly different model families. They're all transformer language models, but not just necessarily duplicates of the same. And so you can see this kind of, the red is saying that the argument to the function, the Poland here, peaks in about 2/3 to 3/4 of the way through the model, and then you can see it get overtaken by the Y, the Warsaw here. So this kind of gives us a place in the model that it seems to be applying this type of function. We can look at whether the representation here is in fact kind of transferable and modular, like is it really a representation of this function? So we can identify this, basically some feed-forward networks right at that place in the model, and you can take the neurons that are the output of that feed-forward network. So we can take them in a single pass. If we say something like, what is the capital of Poland? We can pull out these neurons here right before it says Warsaw. And what we want to do is transfer them into a kind of neutral context where the model is going to produce a word that it could plausibly be an argument to this function, but it doesn't really have signal that it should be applying the capital city function here. And what we would like to do is, if we can splice in just these neurons, if we can get the model to, in this case, produce Beijing, this would tell us that these are kind of functional neurons, not like Warsaw neurons or something. And you can see that in this case, this is exactly what happens. The model produces Beijing in this kind of neutral context rather than China. And this is also quite reproducible across different tasks and models. And you can see there's a consistent effect where these kind of neurons are communicating this generic kind of function information, not perfectly, but quite consistently. So like, I think an important part of this functional compositionality is not that, is that we can do this kind of transferability, but obviously the world doesn't divide into like the things that are arguments and the things that are functional outputs, but we want to be able to compose them more freely. So maybe instead of saying we're going to apply the capital of to China and get Beijing, we might have these kinds of nested operations where we would say, okay, there's a park, the Yellow Mountains, that's in China. What's the capital of the place where the Yellow Mountains are? And we can chain these things together. And so what we'd like to see if we get this kind of chaining compositionality is we should see the same pattern, but it should have this kind of periodic function. So you should first see that the model promotes the argument X, then it promotes the value of this intermediate computation, the Z, which is the output of this A function, along the way to then finally producing the Y. And you can see this in this specific case. So getting a park to the country and then the country to the capital, you can see this intermediate value surface around the middle. And on aggregate, across a lot of these kind of multi-hop tasks, we see this shape quite nicely, where there's a clear stage in the middle layers where the value of this A of X function, which is really an intermediate step along the way of computing B of A of X, it becomes the top prediction before being overtaken. I think a nice piece of evidence that we're looking into more is that this is characteristic of cases when the models produce the correct answer. On average, when they're producing the incorrect answer, you don't see a signature for this intermediate variable, which might suggest there's a connection between failing to compute the intermediate value and failing to compute the task. I'll come back to this example a bit later when I talk about the kind of idiomatic and the conventional nature of compositionality. but kind of as a stepping back on this issue of functional compositionality. So I think, to me, this is an interesting and I would say non-obvious outcome of neural networks, that even if we're just talking about how do they solve tasks, I think typically, when, like by default, when I think about a neural network, I think of the phrase like they are function approximators, right? And if you're approximating a complex composite function, you're not really required to approximate the whole process, the kind of constituency structure of the functions you can just go straight to producing last thing. So it's interesting and maybe not required that neural networks would do this intermediate computations along the way and that we would be able to find these pieces, right? So I think this is actually quite an exciting finding, and that that they have these kind of properties that we expected in the more traditional symbolic kinds of architectures. They're localizable and they're transferable across contexts. They appear to be chained together, at least in some cases, to support these more complex reasoning chains. So I would say kind of a counterpart to functional, I sometimes debate about how much there is this distinction between structural and functional in neural networks, and I think this is a kind of interesting question that's both philosophical and then very just literal. But there is some kind of a distinction, especially like in the world of causal models, we often distinguish between like the function and the structure as not necessarily the same thing. And I think in neural networks, we can think about this distinction. So there's the kind of functional, the functional structure of the thing it is computing, and then there's the structure of the network itself, which is like the weights and the parameters, right? And so one of these other findings that I found most surprising is that there's quite a bit of structure to that part, to just the architecture of the model itself when it is computing these kind of compositional functions. So this is work mostly by my student, Mikey Lepori, who might be here. I'm not sure. If he is, you can ask him hard questions. So I think to get your head around kind of like what is meant by structural compositionality, I think a nice example is this kind of idea. If someone says, don't think about pink elephants, you are like certainly thinking about pink elephants. And this is because just the structure of the thought, don't think about pink elephants, just literally contains the thought pink elephants, right? Like you cannot think this thought without instantiating the parts. And this is, so this is kind of this key idea in structural compositionality, which is that the representation of the whole just literally contains the representation of the parts. It's not merely a function of them, but it contains them, right? When we think about neural networks, there's different ways we can instantiate this, but like I said, one of the things that I've been very interested in, one of these kinds of emerging consistent findings, is this idea that some of this structure really is just baked into the weights themselves. So we can start by looking at a pretty simple example of a model. Here we're looking at a visual model trained from scratch on an odd one out task. So here the rightmost image is the odd one out, and you can see it breaks from the others because it's neither following the insideness nor the in contact rule. What we're going to do is train a model from scratch to do this odd one out task, so it doesn't get direct supervision on the features we're interested in, for example. And what we're looking for is whether there is a subnetwork, so just a subset of the weights of the model that correspond to kind of computing whether insideness is true, and a separate one for looking at for computing whether contact is true. And what we want to test whether these are kind of, these subnetworks truly kind of capture these features, is that if I use just the located insideness subnetwork, it should be able to compute the odd one out task when it depends on insideness, but not when it depends on contact. So this is like checking that, in fact, this thing is, yes, computing insideness, but it's not just like a pruned version of the whole. Right? It can't do everything. It's kind of specific to doing insideness. And so in the results, we'll visualize that as like points in this top left corner. And then the opposite should be true if I ablate out this, so like literally just zero out these weights and use the remaining network to do the task, that I should be able to compute odd one out when it depends on contact but not on insideness. So this is checking that the insideness feature is kind of local to these weights. And so across a range of models we tested, and these are in a few different vision and language tasks, a few different architectures and backbones, you can see that this pattern just largely holds up quite well. Where you can find these networks that are kind of specific to these subroutines that are necessary to do the task, and when you ablate them out, you kind of specifically remove that ability without large collateral damage. Again, it's not perfect, right? So they're not. It's not entirely intended to be strongly. These are examples on kind of a toy task that we train ourselves, but I think one of the dominant findings from a lot of interpretability on large language models recently has been a similar kind of specialized weights in how these models carry out specific tasks and behaviors. So this is not my work. Some work from Wang et al. A couple years ago has become pretty famous for finding a circuit within a large language model for doing this simple task, right? So this is a task you say Matthew and Robert had a lot of fun at school. Robert gave a ring to blank. It's supposed to say Matthew. And they find kind of a set of specialized components that do this. There's a set of weights called the duplicate token heads that basically say there's a duplicated name here, Robert. Then there's a separate set that we call the inhibition head that basically blocks attention to the duplicated name. And then there's a final head set of weights that copies names, but it can't copy the duplicated name because those have been inhibited, so it copies the correct name. And this allows it to correctly produce for sentences that fit this template. It can correctly produce Matthew. So this is interesting in its own right because you get these kind of specialized heads carrying out these specific functions. What I found especially exciting is that, again, these are kind of reusable and reproducible, right? So they don't just get used in the context of predicting Matthew here, but my student Jack found that you can, that they get reused. Well, first they reproduce across larger models, so similar but not identical models. And then they get reused in different tasks. So in this case, it was like, describing what color an object from the list is. So on the surface, a very different task that uses many of the same components. And in fact, if we kind of exploited the fact that it was missing some components and forced it to, rewired it to use those components, you can improve task performance. So there's, significant modularity and reuse across tasks here. My other students, Ru Chen and Chinan, found that these same components reproduce also across languages. So even on a model trained on entirely different data, all Chinese text, for example, you can find the same components localizing to about the same weights in the model, even for very different models. So there's something quite consistent and maybe universal to how transformers are solving tasks, that you find these kinds of localizable weight components in. So I think the structural compositionality component observation is quite interesting. And again, I would say, to me, highly non-obvious for how we think about neural networks. I think there's a sense in which, we maybe would expect that the space in which they operate, in activation space, these are complex subspaces that have a bit of structure. But in the weights themselves, these could be highly superimposed along the weights, and they're just not required to have these kind of discoverable components. So the fact that this sometimes happens, it definitely doesn't always happen, and there are probably more examples of it not happening than happening. So the fact that it happens at all is interesting and tells us something about how these systems kind of self-organize as a result of training in response to data signals, that I think gives us something we should be looking into more as kind of a broader theory of compositional structure in humans and in other kinds of systems. And so, like I said, these first two pieces of kind of functional and structural compositionality, I think of as, to a hardcore, Fodorian, I think would not be satisfied, but to me as a, Fodor curious kind of a person with who has some sympathy for this symbolic account of things, I think these are reassuring and reminiscent of the kinds of things we were looking for in these traditional systems. But of course, we don't actually want just the full-on traditional systems, because they are also not good accounts of how humans behave. We are very often don't behave perfectly compositionally, perfectly systematically. And so I think the last really important part of how we're looking at large language models and how they behave compositionally is looking at the ways in which they deviate from this kind of idealized behavior in a way that I think makes them much more reflective of human behavior. I've worked on postdoc Jake Grusin and following with Porv. So I want to start by motivating this by coming back to this example that I mentioned earlier. So here I had said that kind of on average, when you look at these tests, you see this strong signature of this intermediate computation, this A of X variable. But this is definitely not the case for every individual task we look at. So we have some examples where there's, just a really beautiful, so take a word, take its antonym, translate it into German, and you see this just perfect looking signature where the English antonym surfaces first and then it gets translated to German. But then you see other examples like this one where you're saying take a number, add 100 and multiply by 2, and there's absolutely no signature of any intermediate variable. It actually just seems like the model just directly computes the answer without going through any intermediates, and we checked several valid intermediates for how to do this computation. And then there's ones that kind of fall in between. So this like finding the capital city of a country where a landmark is located, where you can see a signature for the intermediate, but it doesn't really rise to the point that we would look for to say that it's like engaging the mechanism that I was describing before of this kind of task and things. So there's quite a bit of continuum here in terms of what I would say all the tasks in the table on the left are things that like, to me as like from a software engineering standpoint would say these have the same functional form. You could represent all of them as like f of g of x or something, but to the model clearly are not all being solved using the same kind of compositional process. And one thing we know about the kind of input to these models is that they're taking in these structured embedding spaces, and these things we know are highly structured, right? Even before large language models, there was a lot of work on word embeddings, and we could find examples of these kinds of linear relationships, like a direction that connects countries to their capital cities. But there's also these kind of higher order functions in there too that aren't as directly decodable. So our kind of hypothesis here is that when the model can like easily detect this relation, even if we might say it is a 2-hop or 3-hop relation, the model detects it as like strongly encoded in the embedding space. There's no need to solve it compositionally. Whereas if you have one of these relations that's going to require some reshaping and some rotating, then it's going to work across layers and solve it compositionally. And so we can measure that by just looking at the linearity of the relation in the input embedding space. So this is just how much can you predict the y from the embedding for y from the embedding from x, just using these kind of first layer representations of the inputs. And on the y-axis, we're looking at basically how compositionally the model appears to solve the task, which we kind of approximate by just how strong of a signal is there for that intermediate a of x. You can see a quite strong correlation here where exactly as we're expecting, the more linearly encoded the relation is, the less compositional the processing signature. And it's true. And it's interesting to point out that this is actually only weakly correlated with accuracy. So the model can do both things well. It can do the compositional thing well and the direct computation non-compositional thing well. So it's not just that it's doing things better or worse at one end of the thing. These are just two alternative processes for solving what we might call compositional tasks. You can shift to other things, kind of another type of domain and task instead of experiments that I think illustrate a similar idea. So we know that humans also are kind of condition dependent in their compositionality. Here's a task from work by Decker et al. That's asking humans to do this compositional generalization task where they have to place colored animals along a grid. And so here the underlying grid basically has colors along the columns, animals along the rows. And humans can do this very well, so they can recognize that the blue owl goes in the first slot here. If you provide them with something like a blocked curriculum here, so you make it really clear that the rows are colors and the columns are colors and the rows are animals. If you provide this kind of shuffled curricula that technically provides the same amount of information, you get access to coverage of all the rows and columns, the same number of examples, then they actually don't generalize compositionally quite well. And so there's this kind of theme here that the way, the kind of transparency with which the rules are expressed in the data, in the training, affects how compositionally the system, the humans here and the networks are able to behave. In this project we're looking at, I think this is captured quite nicely if you look at kind of the interplay between the in-weights learning and what's called in-context learning in modern neural networks. So these things are obviously connected, but you can kind of think of them as separate systems, and they sometimes get talked about as though they're separate systems when we're talking about current AI. So we have weights which produce some pattern of activation in a given context. This pattern of activation is yielding some behavior which gets some reward or loss, and on the basis of that you go back and update the weights. But of course, over time, as you get better at this, then there's certain types of patterns that are just consistent with patterns you've seen before, and you can figure out new problems in activation space. This gets called zero-shot learning, in-context learning. You could argue about whether it's learning. It's basically, this is just consistent with your patterns, and you can make the correct prediction. And in that case, you're going to incur no loss, not update the weights, right? And so this gives us a really natural way of saying this is going to break out so that when you get inputs and when you get contexts that are kind of following the rules that you've learned to encode well from training, you'll solve tasks in activation space, you'll behave compositionally there, it'll dominate. Otherwise, you're going to fall back to the in-weights learning, and that's when more traditional neural network type of learning will take over, and it'll look idiomatic and non-compositional. So we meta-trained some neural networks to do this kind of colored animal tasks. And we can see the kinds of patterns we're expecting. So for example, when the model solves the task in context, you get good compositional generalization and the strong blocking advantage, the same as we saw in humans. But then you can kind of break it. So you can take this grid and now you can rotate it so that it's no longer like following the rules of training. And for humans also, this task becomes much harder once it's much more difficult to verbalize what the rule is. You can't say the animals are on the rows and the colors are on the columns. Now you have this rotated grid that is less easily accessible to humans. In this case, humans also struggle with the task. And we can see here the models fail entirely. They can't use in-context learning in the rotated case. But then the in-weights learning can take over. So of course, across repeated exposure to the rotated grid, you can now learn this set of rules, and you can start to behave well and compositionally there too. But in that case, when you're in the in-weights learning regime, you lose the blocking advantage, take over, it starts to look like normal neural network learning. So you can see this kind of back and forth where the context kind of, when it's consistent with your rules, you behave compositionally, you follow the rules. When it doesn't, you fall back into your kind of traditional neural network learning, and this happens without a lot of anything special needing to happen. So stepping back here, I think something that's quite exciting about studying compositionality in neural networks is their ability to kind of be these types of hybrid systems and kind of expose what this hybrid mechanism might look like, right? And in particular, we see this kind of picture where they can learn these kind of primitive features from their training, and then they can behave compositionally, and according to these primitive features, they can flexibly recombine them in the ways we would expect. But then when things don't follow that, they can fall back and behave idiomatically. And in fact, I would say the idiomatic thing is primary in the neural network, as we've kind of long thought to be. But what kind of emerges is actually this exceptional case, which can become more and more blend, which is the thing that appears flexible, compositional, and semi-symbolic. We'll just wrap up and end also a minute early, keeping in Luke's tradition. I think right now we're in a very exciting position where you have large language models. They currently are best non-human examples of human-like behavior. And so they have this kind of ability to provide both like an existent proof of what we'd say like the how possibly mechanisms, like how might this look, and those also kind of serve as nice starting hypotheses for how actually might this happen in a human. So this can kind of be a really welcome opportunity to make very rigorous scientific progress on things that are kind of long-standing debates. I think compositionality is a really good example of this because we all kind of acknowledge that there is something compositional to human behavior, but actually dealing with it can quickly get marred in like debates about definitions and assumptions about mechanisms. And we can instead just be purely descriptive and just say, let's see how large language models do it and let's start them. And I think when we do that, we get this kind of nuanced picture where there's like a lot that's familiar to past arguments. It's almost the kind of thing you could say, like, did we know that already? Didn't we say that already? But it's not quite. It doesn't exactly fit in what's been proposed, right? So we see certain things that are quite characteristic of what would have probably been associated with the kind of symbolic cognitive architectures, very famous in traditional AI, and also pretty dominant, I would say, in cognitive science as a theory, as a way of a lot of higher cognition happens, right? So we see these structured modular representations, and I think interestingly, we see that it's kind of represented in the kind of task and function space, and also in the weights, at least sometimes. But then we also see, as expected, that they're still neural networks, right? So they're quite idiomatic and context sensitive. We're not getting this like bottom-up perfect compositional structure. Instead, they can kind of naturally mirror this duality where they behave compositional sometimes and non-compositional at other times, depending on the data depending on the kind of conventions of the training data and the way they've been trained. I'll end there. Thank you so much.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. We have plenty of time for questions. So what I'm going to ask is raise your hand. Ellie, I'll let you call on people, but then while you're waiting for someone to bring you a microphone, can I ask that you stand up to make it easy to make sure everyone can find you?
I guess I'll start with someone with the mic. Are you a runner or? Yeah, are you a runner? I can't tell who's a runner and who's trying to.
Question right here.
Question over there.
Thank you. That was a fascinating talk. I want to ask about tying it back to Luke's talk, which was also very fun. Do you have any insight as to how this compositionality might emerge in multimodal training?
Yeah. Yeah, so this is a question we're very interested in. I have several students working on these types of questions in multimodality. Do I have thoughts on it? It's hard. So like I've been like wanting to give a talk on multimodality, and the results, like there's not a good story yet. I think this is kind of what Luke is pointing to. Part of the problem is a bit the open science issue. I think like the small language models are good enough. My guess is consistent with probably what Naomi was saying, because the information is denser, you can do better with less data, and the mechanisms in those models seem to be, similar enough to what happens in the bigger models, so we can work on them. The multimodal models, there's like CLIP, and like these better ones, like we're just starting. Like I think the multimodal technology has lagged the language technology, right? And this kind of work really depends on having a system that is like, as a starting point, good and performant. I think what's also, I would love to be told otherwise by somebody working in cognitive or neuroscience, but I think there's like less of a inventory of like what are the debates, what to look for, because I think in human learning, this idea of like grounding or multimodality, it can be taken for granted a bit more. So there is work on how the modalities integrate, but there's not like the strong discussions on things like compositionality that have really existed in the purely language side. So it makes it a bit of a wide open field that can be harder to figure out like where to start, because for interpretability, you kind of have to start by knowing what to look for. So we've been poking around a lot. I hope in a year or so we'll have like a good talk on multimodal structure. And I have a student, Tien, who's defending a thesis that is ostensibly about this. So, but I think his talks are a mix of results that make it hard to say what the one takeaway is, right? I think that's just the nature of it. Yeah.
I'm curious about how much the training regime will have an impact. Like you can say, as a kid, I learned maybe because someone breaks down that compositionality to me. Like, say it this, here is how I do it, and this is how you did it wrong. And arguably, if we look at like modern training with reinforcement learning, it starts having like at least a tiny bit of that flavor. And so I wonder if the way how networks are trained shows up in different generalizations.
I would absolutely expect so, right? Like I think one thing that has always been true and is especially true now is that you can't really separate architecture from training and training data. Like one thing I would say is like a big outcome of the recent wave of AI is that like a pre-trained model just has a different architecture than the from scratch model, right? So I think that is true and will be true for other kinds of training as well. Like we can't separate these things. And so, yeah, I think like one point that I was trying to make is like the behavior of the model kind of depends on what inventory of concepts and things have been built into it from the regular in-weights training, and then these get freely recombined. Something like instructor or caregiver exposing a process to a kid does depend on the kid having a pretty good innate set of concepts to make use of that, right? I'm not going to explain to a 6-month-old baby like, oh, well, the reason that you failed to latch is because this, right? Like they're just going to reinforcement learn it. But then, and that's where you kind of get, once you get into this secondary stage of being able to learn, where you can learn from instructions or learn in context. Of course, I think in the modern AI, we have this kind of binary between it, like you pre-train the thing and then you in context learn the thing. In a human, these are much more fluid, where you're, and so I think there's a ton of room to explore this richer space, but I would be absolutely floored if these did not interact in a pretty deep way. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. I really enjoyed the talk. I think compositionality is really important. So I'm not going to be very popular here in about 2 seconds. Your model, that was a 24 level model that you did some analysis. So, from a neural point of view, the brain has maybe 10 levels of synaptic distance from thalamus to frontal cortex. So, not just this, not just this analysis, but basically all of the models many of the models being talked about here, there's such a disconnect between the numbers of levels of processing. So what about that?
I'm so glad you asked, because actually I think this is, so the motivation or why we got into some of these multi-hop processing things is our working hypothesis is that the transformer is compensating for a lack of recurrence. And so actually, like, transformers have a lot of layers, but they don't have recurrence. And like when you look at some of these error patterns, and I think this ties nicely to Luke's talk with some of these like kind of recurrent things happening in the diffusion models. Like there's room to improve the transformer. So like if you look at some of these types of things, well, these are the right ones. Like basically you can see that it'll sometimes mess up because it computes A of X too late. And what we find when we do these analyses is that there's a ton of redundancy in these middle late layers, where it's basically has the ability to call the function at any layer between 16 and 24, but not before or after that. So if you mess up and it takes you a little bit too long to figure out what country this landmark is in, you've missed your ability to get the capital city and you're screwed, and then you get it wrong. So there's like a need for recurrence here. So I actually think you could get away with a smaller model if you had recurrence, and you don't need recurrence everywhere, right? And I think there's some way to bring this in closer alignment with the brain that should improve the model's ability to do this multi-hop stuff. But again, I think AI kind of works around it, both by the model faking recurrence in a forward pass, and now we're seeing these reasoning models that are, I think, compensating for that on the test time compute side of actually outputting tokens and stuff. So there's a ton of like workarounds where models are compensating, but I think probably better architectures, you could probably tighten this model and not lose power or something. It's an interesting direction. Oh. Yeah.
You talked about similarities, but have you noticed any major qualitative discrepancies between how LLMs and humans use compositionality?
This is a great question. I think I wish I had just like a list of them, because I think in some ways they're like there's some that are so obvious that it's like we don't bother documenting it. I think there's a lot of good examples in like vision models where I don't know if it's an issue of compositionality or an issue of the inventory of primitive concepts, but where LLMs or vision models will, for example, over-differentiate. So in an earlier model, for example, you'll see like dog head facing left and dog head facing right are just different concepts, right? I don't know if that's true in the modern vision models, but you'll see this kind of thing. And again, it can compensate, right, with the right supervision, but this is not a single concept, which means the compositional structures operating on those are just going to be kind of different. And so I think we've been doing some work in like this kind of logical concept learning, and this is kind of our working hypothesis, is that, so I can't say for humans, in a symbolic system, you would have like one not, and it negates everything. And it can negate not blue, or it can negate not, and then an entire composition, right? I think in the LLM, you would find many knots that are kind of domain-specific knots. Now, my colleague Roman Feynman in cognitive science and developmental stuff, who works with, like, it's actually kind of open whether humans have one true knot, or whether they have domain-specific knots, or whether they initially have domain-specific knots and then they later merge after like formal instruction into a domain general knot. And so I think that's like, there's a lot of room here. But I think for a lot of these questions on compositionality, like the truth is we don't really know what humans do. Like we have kind of the symbolic system story, and now we have this. And so that's, I think, where there's a really nice opportunity to say, well, here's two ways of getting this kind of behavior, and then trying to look for evidence in humans. I'm sure I should just have a better list of specific examples, because LLMs do all kinds of bizarre stuff, that isn't very human-like. Yeah.
Thank you very much for the wonderful talk. I would have a question about this grid compositional task with the animals and the colors. And you did this rotation, which they weren't able to initially solve. They had to treat it like a new task essentially, and do the neural network learning. And I'm curious if if you did another rotation, would a model that had learned the first one, would it have an improved learning rate in the second? In other words, is it using a compositional approach to solving this rotation on top of the initial compositional task, or is another rotation going to be treated as another context that it has to learn from the neural network weights?
You mean like a rotation that's like in between these two, like a 45 degree kind of thing? Yeah, that's really interesting. So like what we saw when we do the learning on these is you see kind of the expected catastrophic forgetting, where it starts to learn the rotated thing, does bad on the aligned, and then when you bring in the aligned one, it goes back to doing. But these are very small models. My guess would be that if you add in another rotation, especially like as you move towards continuously, like every new thing is generated at a random angle, I think it would actually learn a pretty good space, because it would, speculating, but I think it would learn a representational space that says, oh, the thing that matters here is actually axis and rotation. Like that's what you would hope it would learn. So the point is, like during training, it kind of learns the basis, like it learns the features that are going to matter. If it's only ever seen an aligned thing, it learns rows and columns matter, and why should it suppose anything else, right? Then you see this other thing that's like, oh, actually this matters. Maybe with enough interleaving of these two things, it could learn, am I in condition A or B, as you smooth it out. And I think this kind of another big finding that I haven't seen a really formal study on, but I think is commonly accepted, is that like data diversity is quite key for these models' ability to generalize. So I think this would be kind of like approaching that, like the more diverse the data, the more general the solution.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks so much.
We have time for one more question.
Okay, yeah. Right here, yeah.
Yeah, really awesome talk. I had a question that's probably more about the middle of your talk when you're mentioning the shapes. And compositionality seems a lot more straightforward with language if it's based on a symbolic logic. But I was wondering from an evolutionary perspective if it's more based in perception, like with object recognition, how would compositionality work on a perceptual level?
This is a really good question. So I think this is a pretty open line of discussion. I think there's a nice kind of review article that came out a couple years ago by Jake Quilty Dunn, who's like a philosopher, cognitive scientist. I would say it's like the update of the photo position that's more measured and nuanced, takes in more modern data, but still really advocates for this kind of symbolic language of thought being the best model of human cognition. He actually draws a lot of the evidence from perception. But one thing that he says that I think I would agree with is that this isn't like these kinds of things that we think about, like systematicity, compositionality, filler role independence, these kinds of features aren't really like you have them or you don't, but they're kind of a cluster of things that tend to co-occur so that when you have one, you have another. But it's not always all or nothing. And then he has a lot of examples from the domains of vision and like non-human primates and things as well to show that like in vision, you tend to find these kinds of features, these language of thoughty features. But it's kind of this softer notion of it where it's like, yeah, I mean, evolutionarily, I would be really open to some theories that say this gets bootstrapped from the structure of the world, which is, compositional, but like not perfectly, right? Like it's well approximated by a symbolic compositional system, but then it's ultimately just the world with all of its mess. And so maybe we learn some of these things because they're useful. One could even call them heuristics that allow us to plan and make predictions and generalize. And then we like that and we exploit it. I guess it's kind of like Conrad's talk yesterday. It's like humans then conceive of the world to consist of this kind of thing because we like these kind of sparse causal models that feel compositional. So yeah, I feel like there's a through line there, but it would need to be worked out obviously pretty extensively.
Thank you.
Thank you.